Welcome, Dr. Michael Bustamante, to Conversatorio Cubano. We are delighted to have you here to comment a little bit on the contemporary political conditions and policies towards Cuba. And so I want to just jump right in and note that most of us know that President Biden had chosen to leave Cuba on the list of countries sponsoring terrorism during his administration. And then at the last minute, really almost last hour, he decided to take Cuba off that list and lifted the designation. So one of the questions that I haven't heard a lot of folks asking is what might be the legacy of President Biden's policy towards Cuba, including this final decision to take Cuba off that list?
Well, thanks for the question. It's good to be with you. I don't know. I mean, I think the legacy's still in formation, right? I think future years will shape some of that. But at least on this last minute designation or delisting of Cuba from the SSOT list, there's not much of a legacy. He did it the last minute, and as soon as Trump came in, he slapped Cuba right back on the list on I think it was day one or two. I forget at this point. So but the context of that delisting, that did not happen in isolation, right? It happened as part of this kind of triangular negotiation that I gather had been ongoing for some months prior and I think increasing in intensity after Kamala Harris lost and Trump was reelected, between the Cuban state, the Vatican, and the White House to try to make some headway on the one hand, one of the government of Cuba's big ask, which was getting delisted from the SSOT list, and then one of the Biden administration's big asks, which was some positive movement on the fate of political prisoners, particularly those who had been detained after the historic protests in July 2021. So the announcement to delist Cuba from SSOT occurred, I think, shortly before the government of Cuba announced that, seemingly in a separate deal that has nothing to do with what Biden just did. This is how it was officially presented. The government of Cuba was responding positively to a request from Pope Francis to, liberate prisoners. So I think that's a humanitarian win. And as I heard one former diplomat tell me, if you believe that Cuba was always sort of didn't belong on that list, maybe the terror list, maybe it belongs on lots of other lists, but not that one, then essentially what is the United States given away? Maybe very little to at least get some folks freed. I think one of the especially having maybe a reasonable degree of confidence. This is one of the things I wonder. Did they do this knowing full well that the Trump administration is going to come in and reverse it on day one? And then they say, well, okay, we'll at least get some folks out of jail. And I think, over 100 folks were released in the first few days before they got put back on the list. And since then, Cuba, I understand, has frozen any future releases of prisoners, though ostensibly their commitment to continue with those releases was about a request from the Pope, not a request from Washington. So they're in a little bit of a pickle there. But anyway, the thing about Biden's legacy and this sort of last minute move, I think, was the most significant thing that he probably did on U.S. Cuba policy. I don't know. It's hard to figure out how to interpret it. Maybe they do it as sort of a let's get a humanitarian win, even if it'll be sort of reversed very quickly. But I think the other thought that some folks have is I was very surprised that they did this at all in lame duck, because I had heard some chatter leading up to the election that if Kamala Harris had won, that perhaps the Biden administration would consider this step as a way to kind of get the ball moving on some Cuba policy measures and kind of take the political hit for an incoming Harris administration. Oh, we didn't do it, they did it, kind of a thing. But when Trump won, the sort of conventional wisdom I was hearing was that any talk of movement on U.S. Cuba policy in the lame duck was a dead letter, because all it would do would sort of put a bigger target on Cuba's back for the incoming administration than was already going to be there. And we have certainly heard a lot of tough talk coming from new Trump administration officials who are in charge of Latin America policy and things like that. So we'll have to see how sort of quickly the Trump administration moves to reimpose some other sanctions, travel restrictions, remittance restrictions, et cetera, that the Biden administration had eased a little bit earlier in its term. So I think, overall, the legacy of Biden on Cuba is an equivocal one. I'm also thinking about this in connection with the recent news just in the past couple of days that former Senator Bob Menendez was found guilty of corruption and sentenced to, well, he had been previously found guilty, but now he's been sentenced to 10 years in jail. And the other truth was that at least for the first 2-3 years of the Biden administration, pretty much all Cuba policy that they were thinking about had to pass through the filter of Bob Menendez, who was a highly influential member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and was not afraid to use his threat of a veto on other crucial things for the Biden administration over the seeming minutia of Cuba policy. So I think the Biden administration didn't call his bluff in on a number of occasions, and I think in some ways, I didn't expect the Biden administration to do much at the very beginning. They were coming in; it was still in the middle of a pandemic. Let us not forget. But by the time the July 11th protests happened in 2021, the Biden administration hadn't done anything, and then suddenly they're kind of caught flat-footed and have to respond in some way. And they do that by slapping on, I think largely symbolic sanctions on Cuban government officials that are already pretty much prohibited from doing much business in the United States anyway because of the embargo itself. So at that point, the optics of moving forward on Cuba policy were not the same as they would have been otherwise. And I don't think the Cuban government did much in the 3 or 4 years of the Biden administration either to sort of incentivize a Biden administration to move. They know full well that U.S. policy isn't formulated in a political vacuum, rightly or wrongly, right? And the things that they do or don't do are going to raise or lower the political costs that a U.S. administration has to pay for easing sanctions. So there's a lot of blame to go around, I think, for some of the stalemate of the last few years, while the crisis has deepened politically, economically, and I don't see any prospect of that improving with the new administration, despite all the tough talk that the days of communism are numbered, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, in many respects, you sort of have answered in part my second question, which has to
Sorry.
do. Oh, not at all. The longer and more in-depth the answers, the better we like them at Cuban Studies. So recently, Florida Senator and Cuban American Marco Rubio has been sworn in as President Donald Trump's Secretary of State and has made a priority of visiting Latin America, particularly Guatemala, I think El Salvador as well, in his first trips abroad, which may or may not speak to a general approach, which will be much more intimate with regard to Latin America. But I wonder if you could comment on what you think perhaps the kind of policy towards Cuba might be that Marco Rubio has in mind, and to what degree you think Donald Trump would be endorsing that vision.
Yeah, well, I think, the first days of the administration have given some indication they moved, very quickly right away to undo this last minute Biden commitment on SSOT. I think there was some hope from a different corner of the Cuba world that this last minute Biden deal would make an incoming Trump administration think twice before unwinding it or slapping more sanctions on, because now you have a Cuban government commitment to release political prisoners that seems to be hitched to this U.S. commitment to delist Cuba from SSOT. And so I know some folks were upset, thinking that what Biden was trying to do was box the Trump administration in, right? That to not moving too quickly, lest you endanger the promised release of political prisoners. That was another reading of it. Be that as it may, they don't seem to have cared much about that risk. They slapped Cuba right back on that list, and I think it's to be seen sort of how quickly and how far they go on other measures. I mean, another really relevant piece that they undid right away, which is its immigration policy, but connects to Cuba, is they undid the advanced humanitarian parole program. They've canceled it. This was Cuba was part of a wider advanced humanitarian parole program that the Biden administration implemented to try to create legal pathways to migration, or at least sort of some temporary kind of ability to come to the United States on a temporary basis, which for Cubans means effectively a permanent path, given the Cuban Adjustment Act, to try to deal with these just unprecedented numbers of folks who are arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. That program has been eliminated. Anyone with pending appointments for that or the CBP One app at the border, including many Cubans, have been stranded. So certainly they've moved hard and fast on immigration policy, and that is affecting Cubans, among others. There's a real question too on immigration policy as to what's going to happen with the fate of those who hold something called an I-220A form, which is Cubans who entered, many of them in 2022, 2023, who were not granted official entry into the country in the sort of Byzantine legalese of immigration law, but were given essentially they were released on their own recognizance and told to report to an immigration court at a future date. That status does not count officially as legal entry, and therefore those folks, even if they've been here more than a year, don't qualify for adjustment under the Cuban Adjustment Act because they have officially not entered the country, even though they're in the country. So there's a real question as to whether they are going to be vulnerable for removal. And I know that's causing a lot of anxiety in South Florida and other parts of the Cuban diaspora as we speak. Obviously, immigration policy is not something that the Secretary of State determines, but given the sort of his evident close interest in Latin America and the real focus that the State Department is already playing on migration as a major priority, right? Marco Rubio put out the State Department put out a tweet that I saw, which I found just really striking, that said in sort of bold letters, the era of mass migration must come to an end. And this is just really striking from a department now led by somebody who is a product, as I think we all are, of mass migration in very recent memory. So that being said, I would expect some reversal of the small things that Biden did. When was it? I think it was 2023 when he opened up some possibilities for commercial flights again, particularly to provincial cities, lifted a remittance cap, opened some abilities for people-to-people travel. I would expect some of that to be wound back, but I think the countervailing push here is if this administration and this State Department is also really interested in stemming migration, it is very difficult to do that if the Cuban crisis continues to deepen and deepen and deepen and deepen, right? I think Biden's measures to try to open up some travel and contact and money flows were too little, too late. They were trying to stem this tremendous migration bleeding. I think, Cuba needs much more than sort of Band-Aids, obviously, in all kinds of ways. But I that's where I see the potential room for, I say, maybe some kind of tension between maybe the sort of agenda that the Secretary of State and other advisors might push in terms of a hardline sort of sanctions policy, and also the real priority. I think it's the first priority of this administration is controlling migration. So we'll have to see, how those things play out.
Yes, just to add a wrinkle of irony there, at Secretary of State Marco Rubio signing in, he noted that his parents had come to the United States in 1956 when Cuba was under the Batista regime. And so they were not actually fleeing communism and were surely seeking a better life politically and economically, but we're not fleeing communism. So a lot of people in Latin America would argue that they have a great deal in common with his parents, and he thanked them for coming to the United States. So I think that this is quite a conundrum, and I wonder, because we often do only speak about folks in this country and our perceptions of events, you are somebody who has spent almost 2 decades now, maybe exactly 2 decades, going to Cuba as a researcher and a frequent observer in that capacity. So one of the things that I'm sure that you have noted, as I have, is that Cubans on the island often have views and opinions that do not line up with those of Cubans in South Florida or with our own expectations. And so I wonder if you have any sense for how island Cubans, have understood or seen the election of Donald Trump. Obviously they have a diversity of views, just as any community would. But I would wonder, since you are an expert in this and you have been to Cuba many times and have a lot of contact with those on the island, how would you assess the ways in which island Cubans are seeing the election of Donald Trump, how the Cuban government perhaps has responded to the election of Donald Trump? That would also be an additional question to ask you.
Sure. Yeah, well, well, I mean, full disclosure, I haven't been to the island since this last election. But I was thinking back to the first time Trump was elected in 2016, on the heels of the Obama thing, and look, there were winners and losers in that process among the Cuban people economically, right? We forget that the last Obama years, 2015 and 2016, also had for that time very high numbers of migrants who were leaving because folks made this decision and turned out right. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy that, well, if we're normalizing, then they're going to get rid of the sort of, you can pass go policy toward Cuban migrants generally. So it's get out now or never, right? So anyway, I digress. But what I remember about the election was sort of the shock feeling, the kind of whiplash among Cubans that I knew on the island, but also this sort of sense, and maybe I was guilty of it a little bit, right? That this posturing in the campaign was, it can't be for real, right? This guy, Time Magazine published a story that showed that I think in the late 90s, the Trump organization was in Cuba sniffing around for hotel deals when it was a violation of US law to do that. He's a businessman, right? Like he's going to see this opportunity and he's not ideological. He's transactional, right? And that proved to not be the case. I mean, he made a very raw political calculation that saw sort of the way that votes were turning in South Florida, and I think they doubled down on that in the first administration, and have continued to in the last campaign. I wonder to what extent Cubans, on the island now are have the luxury of that kind of original naivete of 2016 of thinking, well, it might not be so bad, in part because things now compared to 2016, 2017 on the island are just so much worse in all kinds of ways. And so I think the prospect of this administration coming in is really daunting and frightening for many people I know, just ordinary citizens. Ordinary citizens, by the way, who can have very critical points of view on their own government and want it to disappear tomorrow, but not necessarily think that making them suffer, as Cuban people inevitably suffer the effects of U.S. sanctions, in my view, regardless of sort of where they're targeted, because of the prominent role of the state in the economy, right? It's this administration will want to say we're just trying to target the military as one example and not the people, but very difficult to do that. There is collateral damage to sanctions, and I think there's a wide academic literature that questions the effectiveness of sanctions in many ways. But I have to say, I think also because of the tremendous crisis of the last few years, the surge of support for President Trump among Cubans in South Florida, and among recent Cuban migrants also, I don't think starts entirely when one arrives at the Miami airport. I mean, I think there's sort of a sense of, there's a kind of a proxy admiration sometimes for him as a figure of kind of Americanness and a sort of a pure capitalism that can seem sort of the solution to the problems that folks face on the ground. And I think the sort of depth of the crisis is such over the last few years that I think what I've been hearing more and more, and this is sort of general, I've heard it from people kind of in Miami, but also on the island, this kind of, I'm like, I've had it with sort of the halfway approach, whether the halfway approach of the Obama normalization, which was about as full as you might expect from a president, but Congress controls the embargo. I've had it with that, and I've had it with the halfway approach of like little sanctions. It's I've heard people literally say to me, like, either rip off the Band-Aid entirely or send in send in the fighter jets. I mean, and obviously I don't want that. I think that would be catastrophic. But I think that kind of just frustration of just solve the problem for me. Like, if you're not going to sort of get the weight of authority off of my back in a certain way, at least get out of my way to allow me to survive more easily. Or, in fact, come and solve the problem, right? And I think the sort of open calls for intervention, I perceive them less among Cubans on the island, but they've certainly been growing in the South Florida context. I think they're delusional. I don't think, this is an administration that, say what you want about it, does not want to get involved in a protracted war. Though I will say, as much as isolationism, I think, characterizes certain elements of the Trump world and worldview, particularly vis-a-vis traditional American allies and partnerships in Europe and things like that. There is a kind of a muscular Western Hemisphere focus. That is, we're talking, celebrating. It's not Denali, it's Mount McKinley again, right? It's let's take back the Panama Canal. I'm teaching a seminar now that's called U.S. Empire after 1898, and it is an odd moment to be teaching that seminar. So, never say never on some of the more extremist things. I hope it doesn't come to that, and I think and obviously those things grated my own kind of inherited and I think learned Cuban nationalism, but I think people are enough people are so desperate for a solution that they might grab onto something as extreme as that, and that I think is worrying, because I don't think that is a recipe for the kind of Cuba that most Cubans want. It has never been, going back to 1898 or 1906 or other moments of U.S. military intervention. So I'll leave it at that, at the risk of sounding like I'm catastrophizing, but.
I want to just add that I definitely think, ironically, also teaching about McKinley, President McKinley, and the 1898 moment, it was a startling thing to hear the return of an idea, the concept of McKinley's America, which was an expansive imperial America, and which resulted in the ending of the promise of Cuban independence fighters for sovereignty over Cuba in 1898. And as most of us know, for decades thereafter, through the Platt Amendment to the 1901 Constitution, but also, McKinley's America included the permanent occupation of Puerto Rico, and the taking of the Philippines through transfer of sovereignty from Spain. So this is a moment for historians
Yeah.
to have to do a lot of thinking and talking on the ground. I hope we check in with you again in the near future. It has been wonderful to have you. Thank you for your comments and the specificity and complexity of your knowledge. Thank you so much, Dr. Bustamante.
Thanks, Dr. Guerra.